Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. On that segment, the last, it's the 11th of July. So the other thing then is primitive accumulation, a low-wage economy, means that you're looting your plant equipment and your infrastructure. Obvious examples, you make a railroad into a cash cow, right? You simply don't do any maintenance or breakdown maintenance only. You run it into the ground, you suck all the money out, and then you junk it, right? You sell off the pieces. Plant and equipment, you don't do necessary maintenance, and you don't do necessary technological improvement, so that what you're left with is an obsolete, run-down, degraded plant. That's primitive accumulation. What we've got going now in the U.S. is a primitive accumulation or looting economy. Also, environment, right? If it's easier to simply dump a bunch of toxic chemicals in a river rather than going through the necessary treatment and purification, or belching smoke into the atmosphere above a city without putting on the scrubbers and other things, you're obviously saving money, but that's a form of primitive accumulation, and you'll pay for that as China does through the labor force. However, these have got to be real pollutants. We're not talking CO2. We're talking real heavy-duty chemical pollutants. So again, the idea is you've got to have a labor force that's ready to operate at the level of the science that will exist at the midpoint of this century and in the decades after that. And you've got to be constantly updating, upgrading your plant equipment infrastructure and so forth. So that is what will be required to develop a labor force. Otherwise, you cannot compete. You will not have a full-set economy. You will become ethnographic material. So that is what this rent-a-mob in Murrieta actually means. The rent-a-mob in Murrieta, we're informed by sources that a lot of these people are veterans of the Minutemen of the previous decade. We're told that the former leader of that, this guy Simcox, Symcox, is now in jail awaiting trial for child molestation. So he turns out to be a monster in his own right. Simcox. Take a look at that somewhere on the Internet. Now, let's also remember, as we said before, Jubal Early went to Harper's Ferry on the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th of July. He couldn't get any further because Franz Sigel, S-I-G-E-L, the Union commander, retreated to Maryland Heights, a big mountain with some big artillery pieces, a 100-pound cannon at the very top, a 30-pound cannon a little bit further down, and Jubal Early couldn't do anything. He couldn't go directly along the Potomac to Washington as he wanted to, had to go up to the Antietam-Sharpsburg battlefield, then come back down on the Maryland side, still couldn't crack the nut at Maryland Heights, had to leave this entire force in his rear. Then he got to Monocacy, where we had the anniversary on the 9th, on Wednesday of this week. Very interesting battlefield there, a little bit south of Frederick. Here, Lew Wallace came out with a ragtag force from Baltimore, was joined by one division of Army of the Potomac veterans under Ricketts, and they held off Jubal Early all day long. He lost one day, and one whole division, Gordon's division, was essentially smashed and put out of action as an effective fighting force. Then he came down 355 Wisconsin Avenue, camped overnight, strung out, but the main group on the southern side of Gaithersburg today, northern side of Rockville, down 355, didn't go all the way down Wisconsin Avenue, turned off to the left on Beers Mill Road, went over to Fort Stevens. Now, this was an army representing slavery. If you were anybody black and they found you along the way, they would kidnap you. They would send you, they would enslave you. They would send you down south. So this was an army that brought slavery. Don't ever forget it. Robert E. Lee's army was the main pillar and bulwark of slavery. It was when the people in Texas, slaves, Juneteenth was when they heard that Lee had surrendered. That meant that slavery was indeed over. Now, why was slavery not viable? Obviously, ethically and morally, this is abhorrent, it's revolting, it's horrendous. But now, from the point of view of political economy, slavery is not viable for the same reasons that low-wage economies are not viable, but obviously in a more concentrated form. If you have slavery, you've got primitive accumulation against your labor force because you're literally paying them nothing. There was no education. It was indeed illegal to teach a slave to read and write. So if that's the level you're going to be operating on, then this means that a very large part of your labor force is already condemned to an extremely meager survival level of existence, right? This is obviously going nowhere, but it also means that the wage level in the entire society is also dragged down. You could be a skilled worker, and if they have an experienced slave laborer who can come over and do the same job, then you are out, and that slave will be in. So it drags the entire wage structure down towards low wage. And of course, over the past 30, 40 years here in the United States, that's what we've had, the Walmart model. What does it mean? Walmart model is essentially the modernized Confederate model, that it should all be low-wage, rock-bottom, race-to-the-bottom economy. And this is why when you say, I noticed that the Ken Burns Civil War series, the Drew Gilpin Faust got to be president of Harvard based on this stuff, focuses only on the Civil War as death and mourning and morbidity and all this. It was also the necessary, as it turned out, necessary prelude to the modern world. Could have been avoided. We can talk about that another time. It was not inevitable. It had to do with the ability of John Quincy Adams to propose various schemes of gradual emancipation, but this would have been in the 1840s and 50s. Remember Lincoln, by the time Lincoln came into office, a lot of states had already seceded just because they were obsessed with controlling the federal government. The low-wage economy is what you still have in the South. Most of the former Confederate states are the leading places for poverty, child mortality, lack of education, lack of health care, all the rest, right? Low wages, no unions. It's a cultural predisposition to the low-wage economy inherited in the post-slavery era when under Jim Crow and the failed Reconstruction, there was not the necessary confiscation and breakup of large Confederate estates to create a class of independent, prosperous, small-holding former slaves under the protection of military forces as needed. So that didn't happen. So the low-wage economy has gone on and on. Slavery not only accumulated against the slave, it accumulated against everybody else working for wages because their wages were dragged down brutally. The middle class was tiny and embittered. And then it also accumulated against the farmland, right? One of the things about slavery was it had to expand. The question of expanding slavery into the territories, as the Confederates wanted to do, was that they destroyed the productivity of the farmland where they were. They could not put the inputs, the capital improvements, the fertilizer, irrigation, transportation facilities, silos, and all the other capital improvements that go into a modern farming economy. The Confederates simply couldn't do that because they were into looting, primitive accumulation against the slave, against the middle class such as it was, and white workers and so forth, and then against the land. So it was like a cancer. It had to expand or it was going to die. And those are the stakes in the Civil War. So what we're marking today is the last gasp. In other words, the obvious thing was either burn Washington on the 11th of July and have Lincoln lose the election, or when Lincoln came out to see the battle on July 12th, and this may be apocryphal, but I still think if Oliver Wendell Holmes hadn't been there to say, "Get down, you fool," and they had killed him, then slavery might have gone on, and it would not have ended. This ridiculous would not have ended. It would have been expanded all the way to Tierra del Fuego. That all would have been a joint British-Confederate slave empire, and the stuff had been published in the London Economist. So we'll be seeing you next week on World Crisis Radio.